Logical question now is, how do we track the spread of fake news about COVID-19 in South Africa? To talk to me about this, I'm joined by Stuart Jones. He's the project director at the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. Stuart, good evening and thank you for your time tonight. Well, I mean, you and your team of analysts spend at least every day, every 24 hours going through millions and millions of messaging on social media to determine which ones are true and which ones are fake news. So can you say during this period of the pandemic you have seen narrative manipulation on a grand scale?
Hi, Thabo, and how's it, everyone? Yeah, we've seen an evolution of fake news, or as we prefer to call it, mis and disinformation, over the course of the pandemic. In the beginning, it was quite medical, gargle warm water and it'll go away. Then it moved on to these grand conspiracy theories that you mentioned a bit earlier, 5G and Bill Gates and vaccines. Then it moved on to social cohesion, and that's where we're seeing a bit of narrative manipulation on a grand scale, and that's really around xenophobia and racism and privilege and those kinds of issues that are being expressed on social media. Also took a turn towards the end of the lockdown, which was really, really big. And then the latest area in which we are concerned is that we're now entering into the territory of personal responsibility as the lockdown starts to wind down. And so all we really have to save ourselves from COVID-19 are the measures that we can take ourselves, which are hand washing, social distancing, wearing masks, and checking for symptoms. And we have, through the course of the pandemic, seen some issues, particularly around masks and fake news around those, but we're anticipating that to grow. And so, yeah, we are there to find it and fight it as best as we can.
Now, narrative manipulation is not something new. It existed even before COVID-19, especially when you're talking global events. We've seen it when you talk about the Brexit vote. You've seen it when you talk about the Trump presidential election in 2016. We've seen it and we continue to see it, especially around the conversation on global warming. But can we say during this period of COVID-19, money was being used deliberately to manipulate the narrative?
It's hard to trace material back to money, but it is easy to see coordinated efforts that suggest that there is at the very least an agenda, if not a paid agenda. We don't see much use of bots in South Africa. And our suspicion is that that's because people pay other people to spread information. But then we're also very much part of a global world in social media terms. So some of these conspiracies, like the 5G one in particular, originated in Russia by all accounts, and then swept through Europe, ended up in America and got amplified there, and then came into South Africa. So we're also seeing some of these narratives that Trump pushes particularly around the end of the lockdown and those kinds of themes of American liberty and so on, that come into our social media. So it's hard to say, but it's likely that that is the case.
How proactive has government been in curbing the spread of fake news?
What government did so proactively was cut down the first of those things, which was the most dangerous, the medical conspiracies, because those are the ones that make people feel safe when they ought not to feel safe. So you might have people gargling lemon and water and thinking that now they can't get COVID-19, and they shut that down with that legislation that they passed. And heavy-handed as it might seem, it works. We see misinformation of that nature dropping into the social media space and then just not spreading because I think people are too afraid to spread it. That's not so much true of the conspiracies, where I think people feel that the legislation doesn't really apply to those, and the conspiracies spread like wildfire. But the most dangerous stuff, the medical stuff, they seem to have gotten an incredibly good handle on, and also really early on.
Now, some feel Regulation 11, subsection 5 of the Disaster Management Act is too broad and vague in as far as being able to pin down those who spread fake news. Do you think it helped in any way that government criminalized the spread of fake news?
I think that the intention of legislation like that probably isn't, I'm not sitting in government obviously, but probably isn't to genuinely criminalize people and hunt them down. I think it's to dissuade people from spreading information and to have that in their toolbox. There was a fairly famous example of a person who spread a video. I think he I think he stuck an earbud up his nose, and it had something to do with the testing kits being contaminated.
Yeah.
Yes, and he was actually, I'm not sure if he eventually got prosecuted, but he was spoken to by authorities, and that itself was spread on social media. And so people realized that they need to take this seriously. And I think it really helped people to take it seriously, the fact that government was taking it seriously enough to pass that legislation. It is pretty vague to my mind. You've got to be expressing deceit, and which is disinformation as opposed to misinformation. And misinformation is often benign. It's people spreading material without really meaning any harm by it. They just think that they've come across a cure. They want to share it with their friends. Meanwhile, that is dangerous because, of course, there is no cure, and we know that the only things that can possibly stop it are social distancing, mask wearing, washing your hands, and treating symptoms. And so our message really is that if you see mis and disinformation around any of those 4 areas of personal preventative measures that we can take, please assume that they are fake until they are verified.